Hello, I'm Harley Schlanger. Welcome to our weekly dialogue with Helga Zepp-LaRouche, the president and founder of the Schiller Institute. It's October 6th, 2021. The strategic situation continues to be one of great danger, even though there are a number of pathways out of the danger, especially what we've been presenting at a series of ongoing conferences and a conference coming up ahead. But one of the points we've been focusing on is the fraud of the Green New Deal and the effort of the Green New Deal, which is actually creating the energy inflation. And Helga, I think it'd be very useful for you to bring some clarity to this because there's a lot of nonsense in the press on it, but there's an absolutely clear picture of what's happening.
Yes, I mean, obviously the energy prices, especially natural gas, but also oil and energy in general, are just skyrocketing. And this is causing naturally big concerns because, energy prices tend to filter in every production of consumer goods, of capital goods, just because to produce anything, you need energy. So we are right now very, very clearly, objectively on a way of hyperinflation, very much like what happened in Germany in 1923. But there is one major difference, and that is that there is an objective inflation and hyperinflation. That is the result of many years of pumping of money, of quantitative easing, of pumping trillions of dollars and euro into the system. And naturally, this is now showing its effects. But there is also an ideological side to it. Now, I think if you look at the way how the different forces in the world are discussing that, it becomes more clear. Now, the Economist, which is sort of the mouthpiece for the financial oligarchy, the City of London, they have a story this week saying the age of abundance is over. Now we have to all get used to energy scarcity and roaring prices. But then you look at, for example, what the former foreign minister of Austria, Katrin Kneißl, says. She says, this present energy crisis is the result of a whole series of bad policy decisions. And, obviously one of them was the absolute hasty and unreflected exit in Germany from nuclear energy, but also, the whole hysteria to now move out of fossil fuels. And Putin basically said this present hysteria around the energy price explosion is the result of massive speculation. And I think that points to the other thing, that you have now all kinds of investment banks, hedge funds, private equity funds, who all are speculating in the widest possible way on energy prices. And this is driving the prices up to levels which will mean that this will be an enormous expropriation of a lot of people who are already having a hard time paying their energy prices as it is, and who will be bankrupted, including countries who many ministers and prime ministers are talking about a hard winter to come. So there is this objective side of it. But then, I think that there is this whole ideological side, that this is in a certain sense fitting the scarcity, which would not exist because it's a political decision to redirect this policy immediately. I mean, in Russia and China and other countries are investing massively in nuclear energy. So it would be quite easily possible to reverse this. But there is an ideological side to it, namely that it fits the idea of creating a scarcity, and that way, I mean, the Greens at one point or many times actually said, you have to change the behavior by the population to not use so much fossil fuels soon, not at all, but use not so much energy, don't eat so much meat, have smaller apartments, don't heat so much. And the way to nudge them, nudging was this book by Cass Sunstein, that you can change the behavior of a population by, sort of manipulating them. And if things get too expensive, you just stop buying it. This is an ideological idea to reduce the population back to the level before the industrialization. And it cannot work. It would lead to mass deaths in the developing sector, which is already a threat happening in many countries, and it will lead to social explosions in the so-called formerly industrialized countries. So this is absolutely not workable. But it points to the fact that the oligarchy, the financial oligarchy, who know that their system is absolutely finished, they are trying now to hyperinflation the debt away, because the debt disappears if you have a hyperinflation, and at the same time make a super speculative profit, and then either the system crashes, because if they try to, if the central banks start to increase the interest rate to fight against the inflation, you could have an immediate crash, because of the very big indebtedness of many firms and entities, or you have a hyperinflationary blowout like it happened in Germany in November 1923. But the oligarchy, they intend to make a lot of profit in the last phase of this, and let the people see where they may be. So we are in a very, very dangerous situation, and I think a lot of people realize that.
Point you were making from the Economist about the ideological side of it. They said that the energy scarcity will get even worse because those investments are harder in an era of decarbonization, that is, investments in production. Well, that's a decision that was made. That doesn't mean we've run out of coal or oil or the potential for nuclear power. And in that context, you have the comments of Klaus Schwab, which I know you're familiar with, on this idea of stakeholder capitalism, where he's essentially blaming industrialization for the problem.
Yeah, this is incredible. He wrote a new book called Stakeholder Capitalism. And the whole idea is, and there's a big discussion among, financial layers, that the shareholder value society was a big mistake. And all of a sudden, sometimes in 2019, one discovered, a shareholder value society does not function. Now, this is absurd. My late husband, Lyndon LaRouche, has blasted the paradigm shift, which went along with shareholder value society for many decades. And that is known among anybody who knows anything about economic theory and analysis. Because what he said, Lyndon LaRouche said, he said that in the post-war period, you had one paradigm which was characterized on the one side by the Bretton Woods system, which even so it was not what Roosevelt had intended, because when Churchill and Truman carried out the Bretton Woods policy, they left out the most important aspect, namely to increase the living standard of the developing country population. But it created, the Bretton Woods system as it was created, did create a period of relative stability and even growth in the so-called advanced sector. And at that time, you had a morality, which was characteristic, for example, in Germany for the Mittelstand, which was the idea that, the increase of science and technology in the firm, in the investment, is increasing the productivity. And, this enables a larger living standard, longer longevity, and that the family-owned firms would only take as much profit out of the firm as it was necessary, to pay for the salary of the employees, for the family, but otherwise reinvest all the profit into the firm for capital investment, for technological improvement, and that way, keep the engine of economic growth and productivity moving. Now, when the shift occurred to the what Nixon did with the 71 decision to leave the Bretton Woods system, go for flexible exchange rates, which was recognized by Lynn, by my husband, as being the absolute watershed. And he warned this would lead to a new fascism down the road. That went along with a step-by-step elimination of the Glass-Steagall banking separation and more outsourcing to cheap labor production, just-in-time production, arriving at the factory, no more large reserves of any semi-finished products. Just in time, everything would arrive, and money makes money. Shareholder value society, where basically, the shareholder profit would be the holy cow, the holy calf around everybody would dance. And naturally, this led to this incredible increase of the gap between the very rich and, eventually a disappearance of the Mittelstand, or, the Mittelstand became more and more taken over by managers, not so much by people who would be concerned in the long-term sustainability of the firm with the policies I just had described before, but to go for, money makes money, go to the stock exchange, go, to basically to shareholder value. Now that is now over. And Klaus Schwab, who is, obviously one of the key forces in the Davos World Economic Forum, he says as much in his new book. He says shareholder value society and the whole neoliberal system was a mistake, as if this would be a new discovery. And what is needed now is a stakeholder society, which is a very, like a very confused definition, because it's supposed to take care of everything. And they are now working high speed on a new metric, which is supposed to be ready by the beginning of next year, which then will be used, as was the taxonomy before, to create an absolute structure for firms, what you can invest in and what not. Now, what Schwab writes as the reason behind that, he says that the very force which is the driving force for a better living standard and longer life is what destroys the planet through climate change for future generation, and that has to go. So, I mean, this is incredible. I mean, they're basically saying that, the effort, the human capability through creative discovery of new physical principles, new scientific conceptions, which mean, as a scientific and technological progress, you increase the productivity of the production process. That is the problem. And that is what this Greta is babbling all the time when she says the problem is the British, because they started the Industrial Revolution. And, people are just so stupid when they believe that, because, what did the Industrial Revolution do? It freed men from not having to live a life with, workforce just by muscle power, miserable winters, dark, cold. The Industrial Revolution made life agreeable and set creative energies free, so that people could, develop their creative powers and, have a much better human life, increase the population density, increase the population potential of the earth. And this is not ended. I mean, this is such a fraud. I mean, when the Club of Rome started with this, we had, we are sort of, the experts on this, because we had the idea to develop Africa in the 60s. We had development plans, how to overcome the underdevelopment of the developing sector, which were in line with the encyclica of Paul Pope VI, Populorum Progressio, which he wrote in 1967, which was the idea of the development of all people. And this encyclica already said that the injustice is crying to the heaven for vengeance, and it must be overcome. This was a period when the UN had the development decades, the idea that every decade you would define a new development aim to overcome poverty and underdevelopment in the developing sector. That was the debate at the end of the 60s. And we were in the middle of that because of the ideas of Lyndon LaRouche. And that is why when the Club of Rome published this absolutely horrible, fraudulent limits to growth book by the two MIT professors, Meadows and Forrester, we immediately said this is a fraud because when they say that the resources are limited, they totally eliminated the role of technological progress defining what a resource is. You know, what we use as resources has changed tremendously over the centuries, and you know there is no limit to what resources will become in the future because they are the product of the technological level with which you work. You know, like when we can have isotope separation, we can make our own raw materials in the future of thermonuclear fusion technology. So this, we said immediately, this is a fraud. Lyndon LaRouche wrote a beautiful book, There Are No Limits to Growth, as a counter to that. And, you know, as it turned out later, this book by Meadows and Forrester was a fraud because they made a computer model where they defined what should be the result in the beginning and then programmed their model in such a way that the desired result would show up. So this was a fraud, but it started this whole transformation of the student, the SDS and the 68er rebellion. It transformed that into the ecology movement. And in the meantime, naturally, the origins have been forgotten by most people who have been born later than this whole affair. But this was a social engineering of an entire new movement, the green movement. And you know, naturally, this is only rampant in the so-called West. It does not exist in China. It does not exist in Russia. Many developing countries absolutely reject this because they know to fall for this would mean no development for them. So I think that now they are taking out, you know, the real 2x4, ideological 2x4, and say the age of abundance is over. And Alexander King, you know, was one of the leading founders of the Club of Rome. He said it in 1972. He said the biggest enemy of mankind is mankind itself. You know, having exactly this same idea what Schwab is saying in his new book. Now, this is fascism, and I think we should be absolutely clear because this is Schachtian economics. This is a form of cannibalistic economics, which, you know, these people could not care less because, you know, the super rich, these billionaires and multimillionaires, well, why are the real estate prices out of control? Because they are using, you know, their speculative money. They invested in real estate. They invested in other so-called physical goods. And then you can have a hyperinflationary blowout, which wipes out the debt. And then after this, when they come up with their new system, they will control everything. And, you know, a lot of people will not have made it. So this is the most brutal assault on the living standard, on freedom, on democracy, on all these beautiful values they are talking about. It's all a fraud. And the problem is that not enough people are speaking out against it because, you know, I mean, this is really serious stuff. This is fascism, not any less than it was with the Nazis in Germany and other fascist movements in the 20s and the 30s in Europe. So people have to wake up because this is serious stuff which is threatening the life of many people.
Well, as we get into the strategic picture, I just want to point out that China has a different approach to dealing with energy hyperinflation. They're extending credit to increase the production of coal, nuclear, and other sources of electricity. At the same time, they're moving to punish speculators who are engaging in speculation on raw materials and so on. Now, on the China question, look, this is another very dangerous situation with Taiwan heating up. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, the game is, and unfortunately, Biden had another communication with Xi Jinping, which is good and useful, in which it was reinstated that the United States does respect the one China policy. But with Biden, it's always very ambiguous, because he says one thing, but then the Pentagon and many other people are doing many other things. So the situation around Taiwan is very dangerous. Taiwan is part of China. That is the bottom line of the one China policy. It is a red line for mainland China. And in the recent period, there has been an increase. It started already before, but especially in the last several months, an increase of signals coming from the Biden administration that they support the independence efforts by Taiwan. There were official visits, which the PRC protested already very strongly against. There were weapon sales, and in the recent period, China has made very clear they will, if push comes to shove, not allow an independence of Taiwan. And if it comes to a war, they will win the war. This was in articles expressed by the Chinese media. So this thing has now escalated to the point that in the last several days, there were altogether, I think, 56 fighter jets from the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, flying over the air identification zone, which is not the airspace of Taiwan. It's an airspace which is internationally not recognized, but claimed by Taiwan, that it somehow belongs to them, even if it reaches into parts of northern China mainland. But there were these overflights, and then the State Department in Washington and the White House, they put out statements saying that the US is rock solid behind the right of Taiwan to, basically do what they do. Now, this is leading to a very, very tense situation. And, I think this could go wrong very, very quickly. And, it is part of the AUKUS, the US, British, Australian military alliance, which Taiwan also endorsed. And it's part of the containment of China, which, we have discussed many times, is not possible. You cannot succeed in doing it without war, because China is a nation of 1.4 billion people. They are doing economically a lot of things which are right, and therefore they have an incredible economic growth rate. They are now moving. They have succeeded in 2020 to eliminate extreme poverty for everybody in China, and their next goal is now to have moderate prosperity for everybody. So, they're doing a lot of things absolutely right. And therefore, the idea that you can contain them militarily will not work, and it just risks a war. And then the big question is, if the Chinese think they can win the war conventionally, will then it come to the use of nuclear weapons? And then we are talking very quickly about the annihilation of the human species.
Well, we're running a little short on time, but I want to give you a chance to talk about two other very significant developments. One is our campaign to point out the depraved indifference when it comes to dealing with Haiti and Afghanistan, and then also something on the situation in Germany. So why don't you go ahead and say something about our initiatives on Haiti and Afghanistan?
Yes, I can only ask you, our viewers, to absolutely go to the websites of the Schiller Institute, of the LaRouche organization, and watch the programs we wrote, we have written a crash program for both the economic development of Afghanistan and the economic development of Haiti. Both these situations are absolutely out of control. Haiti is presently a hellhole. Now, when the 14,000 or so refugees were sitting at the Mexican-US border, and then the US started to, basically ship these refugees back to Haiti, the spotlight was put on the situation that you practically have no government after the assassination of the previous president. The police forces are in disarray, there is hunger, there is COVID out of control. And it is now clear that this is not only a humanitarian crisis of unbelievable dimensions. There was just a UN Security Council meeting on it where the Russians and the Chinese both called on the international community, saying, that beyond the immediate humanitarian aid, which is naturally the first step necessary, there must be a serious economic reconstruction of the entire country, because otherwise you don't address it. So the potential exists. China, despite the fact that Haiti has not recognized the mainland China, but Taiwan, they had a plan to develop Port-au-Prince and beyond, which was then prevented essentially by the United States. But there is the option of integrating the development of Haiti with the Belt and Road Initiative. And that is an option, and the United States should join hands with China to do exactly that, and other countries as well. Right now, Haiti is a hellhole where basically this place is being used for shipping of drugs from Latin America, Colombia, and other countries into the United States. And it is really a fight for a whole nation, and naturally the whole question of the drug traffic being a major influx in the present banking system. That is something which needs to be changed, and therefore please watch our program for Haiti, which was developed by us in a sort of a crash program because of the emergency situation. And the same goes true for Afghanistan, where now the World Food Program again issued an absolute stern warning that, for example, 3.4 million children are badly nourished. They have not enough to eat and are in danger of dying over this winter. So again, you absolutely need to combine an immediate humanitarian aid for more than 90% of the Afghanistan population, which has been the victim of 20 years of war, and wars before that, but especially 20 years of war of NATO and the US. But there needs to be also a real economic development, because unless you go for basic infrastructure, starting with a world health system or with a modern health system in every country, in this case, starting with one in Afghanistan and Haiti, you will not overcome the endemic problem. So we are right now mobilized for the immediate change in policy on these two terrible situations in Haiti and Afghanistan, and you should join us.
Well, and at a point where Germany could do something to play a role, it's caught up in a fairly absurd negotiation process to choose between a number of very flawed parties for a coalition government. Where do things stand with that in your view?
Well, I think Germany is in for a hard time because, the present coalition talks point in the direction that, there will be a three-party coalition, probably the Greens, the Social Democrats, and the Liberal Party, which has turned more green in order to get ready for such a coalition. Um, you know, the FDP wants to stick to the debt brake, austerity, and are totally on board for the Great Reset. And if the FDP chairman Lindner becomes the new finance minister, well, then the Great Reset is on, which will be naturally totally supported by Scholz, possible chancellor, and by the Greens naturally. And if they would get the foreign ministry, they would go on a full confrontation against Russia and China. So I cannot see how anything positive can come out of that. And I must say this, one may not be the biggest fan of Armin Laschet, but he was a relatively reasonable person who said, no, we should have dialogue and cooperation with Russia and China. And I think that is one of the deeper reasons why they absolutely go after him the way they do. And now they are treating him from the own party, the CDU-CSU, like, it is the most mean, backstabbing, absolutely. I have not seen anybody who did nothing wrong other than not winning the election, but they're now eating him up like a pack of wolves or hyenas. It is disgusting. And I think what the CDU, CSU is doing to themselves right now will mean a good part of the destruction of this party. And I really can only say, that the treatment of Laschet shows you about the character of those who attack him much more than it says about Laschet himself. So, what we are doing right now, we have put out a program, to reconstruct the economy. We will fight for, to keep Germany as an industrial nation. We will have a major conference about that at the beginning of November. You should absolutely get prepared to be part of that. But we will not give up because, the present green policy is madness. It is fascism. It's fascism with a green face, but it will lead to a catastrophic result if it's not reversed. So you should join with us if you think that this green insanity is something which should be reversed. So then you should work with us.
Well, Helga, you've just covered an enormous range of issues and brought to light a number of important points. I want to just bring up one final point, which is that it was 35 years ago, on October 6, 1986, that there was a raid conducted by the War Party, by the neoliberals, the Bushes, and others in Leesburg, Virginia, that was an intent to kill you and your husband, Lyndon LaRouche. And fortunately, it didn't succeed. And I think they're still very upset that it didn't succeed. Do you want to say something about that?
Well, this was quite something, more than 400 FBI agents, armored vehicles, a helicopter. I woke up that morning before 7 o'clock because a helicopter flew by our window of the bedroom. And, we immediately realized this was something extraordinary. And later, a sheriff admitted that this was planned to provoke some incident and have a shootout and get rid of us. So fortunately, we could avoid that. I mean, we placed some phone calls to the White House, and we had an immediate international mobilization. So, I started to make breakfast because I said, no matter what is going on, we have to have cool nerves. So I started to make scrambled eggs. I still insist that this was one of the major contributing factors why nobody lost their nerves on our side. But it was very serious, and it showed the determination to silence my husband one way or another. And I can only say the fact that we are still here, and that all his predictions are now coming true, and a lot of people internationally recognize that. So, I could say a lot more about this question, but it is the anniversary of this terrible incident. And, that teaches you what these people who are so democratic are really all about. So, but we are still here and fighting, and we plan to, get the alternative implemented, which is global development. The real name of peace is development. And that all in the memory of my beautiful husband.
And the legacy of Lyndon LaRouche is still alive, much to the chagrin of his brain-dead enemies and opponents. So Helga, thanks for joining us today, and we'll see you again next week.
Till next week.